So far, we've looked at regripping the golf club and we've looked at shortening the golf club. Today, episode 3, we're going to look at lengthening the golf club. So let's mix up some epoxy. Let's go. Hi everyone, welcome to the Mobile Club Maker. I'm AJ. So today we're going to look at extending a golf club. This is also going to be our introduction into using epoxy for the first time. If you enjoy this video, please go down below and like it, share it with someone, or subscribe to our channel. Just like we've been doing throughout all these Club Making 101 videos, we're going to talk about the tools you need, the process, and any tips and tricks that I think are useful during the job. Let's talk about the tools you're going to need for extending a golf club. Well, first off, we're going to be using a lot of the same tools that we've used in our regripping and in our club shortening videos. From regripping, that's a vise, a rubber vise clamp, grip tape and solvent, and a utility knife with a hooked blade. From our cutting down a golf club video, we'll also need a measuring stick or ruler and something to cut the shafts with, or the extensions with, that being a hacksaw, a pipe cutter, a Dremel tool, or some other rotary tool. Today, we're also going to be needing 2 new tools, the first of which are these. These are extensions. This is a steel extension for a steel shaft. You can also get graphite extensions for a graphite shaft that are made out of some sort of plastic composite. The steel extensions are double-ended, so one extension will do 2 clubs. The graphite extensions are usually just single-sided, so one extension will do 1 club. The steel extensions come in 2 different sizes. They come in a 0.58 diameter and a 0.60 diameter. These match up with the inside shaft diameters. You can go on the shaft maker's website or get a caliper and measure it yourself when you get the grip off to figure out what size you need. You want to make sure if it's a 5.8, you have a 5.8 extension. If it's a 6.0, you have a 6.0 extension. Finally, we're going to talk about epoxy. Like I said in the beginning, this is our first look into epoxy. There are 3 basic kinds of epoxy that we're going to be talking about when we're dealing with golf clubs. There are hundreds of epoxies out there and they have all sorts of different attributes, but in golf there's usually 3 basic kinds that you can find. One of them, like what we're going to use, is a quick set epoxy, otherwise known as a 5-minute epoxy or a tour van epoxy. Basically, it's a fast working epoxy. It allows you to do a couple clubs and then play them quickly. It does not cure to the same strength as some of the other epoxies, but it's good if you're only doing a couple clubs and you need them quickly. There's secondly what's called 30-60 epoxy, which is basically an epoxy that sets in around 30 minutes and cures in around 60 minutes. This is going to be stronger than your 5-minute epoxy, give you a little more time to work. If you're doing 4 or 5 clubs, you can usually get that done with that kind of epoxy. Finally, there's 24-hour epoxy, and like the name says, 24-hour epoxy means it cures in 24 hours, sometimes more. That's the kind of epoxy you'll usually be using if you are reshafting a whole set of irons, a whole bag of clubs, basically a large number of clubs where you need, say, an hour of workable time or something like that. Any of these epoxies will, however, work. You shouldn't really worry that the faster epoxy isn't going to hold as well versus the longer epoxy. In general, if you mix them properly and if you prep your equipment properly, you won't have any issues. As always, I've got my workbench camera up above to give you a little better view of what I'm doing while I'm doing it. So the first thing we're going to do is take the club. I've already taken the grip off and I've taken the tape off. We're going to go ahead and measure it as it is and then figure out how long we're going to make it. So we'll start out measuring. This is a standard sand wedge, 35¼ inches. Of course, with the grip on it, that would play at 35½. Again, that's standard. We'll go ahead and add an inch to this wedge just for the purposes of this demonstration. Next, we're going to take our extension. You want to put the extension inside the shaft so you can measure and cut it knowing how far this extension is going to sit inside the shaft. You don't want to just measure an inch or a ½ inch or whatever off of the extension before you actually put it inside the shaft, because depending on the shaft, sometimes it may sit further in, sometimes it may sit further up, so you want to make sure you're measuring properly and you get the most accurate results. So we'll put this in here, lay this down on here. Like I said, we're going to measure out 1 inch and mark it. So that would be 35 1/4, make that now 36 1/4. We'll go ahead and mark that. I'm going to go ahead and cut this off camera with my Dremel, and we'll be right back. All right, so I just finished cutting the shaft extension with the Dremel, and now I'm basically just taking and roughing up the end of it with a little bit of medium grit sandpaper. This is basically trying to give the epoxy a good surface to bond to. If you just try and put the epoxy on the plain chromed extension or shaft, it's not going to bond as well as if you rough it up a little, give it a little more texture to bond to. Next, I'm also going to do the same thing on the inside of the shaft. Now you can do this with, again, sandpaper that you just sort of crumple up a little bit more and shove down in there, or you can also get these, which are basically sandpaper wrapped around a little dowel, put it in your drill, and it does the job for you very quickly. As always, anytime we do something like that, we want to make sure we tap down the shaft afterward just to get any sort of loose bits out of there that may have come loose, and you don't want them rattling around after you get all finished and put the grip on. All right, now we're going to get to epoxying. Like I said, we are going to use the 5-minute epoxy here because I'm just trying to show you the process. The process that we're going to use here is basically going to be the same regardless of whether you use the 5-minute, the 30-minute, the 24-hour epoxy. It's the same basic process, which is they are all 2-part epoxies. There's a 1 side, 2 sides. Sometimes they come in syringes like this, sometimes they come in 2 separate bottles. In most cases, it's going to be a 1-to-1 ratio. You'll want to look at the package to make sure. Again, there are exceptions. Certain epoxies have a 2-to-1 ratio, 10-to-1 ratio, it depends. Most of the golf ones are usually 1-to-1 ratio, so equal parts. In these syringes like this, it's very simple because they come out at the same time, so you know you're basically getting an equal amount of each. All right, you also want to use something like this, just a little piece of cardboard you can use with the 5-minute epoxy. Now, if you're using the 30-minute epoxy, if you're using the 24-hour epoxy, those epoxies are a little runnier than the 5-minute epoxy. The 5-minute epoxy is pretty thick. It doesn't go anywhere when you start putting it on the cardboard and mixing it. The other epoxies, a 24-hour epoxy, you wouldn't ever try and mix on a piece of cardboard, something flat like this. You'd want to use some sort of little plastic cup, some sort of little container, because it's much runnier and it would just get everywhere if you tried. But in this case, 5-minute epoxy, no problem. I'm just going to squeeze this out. We're only doing 1 club here. We don't need a whole lot of epoxy. We can probably get away with about, I don't know, that's probably more than enough. In general, when in doubt, use a little bit more. You don't want to not have enough. It's also to make sure that you get an equal amount when you're mixing it. If you have more to start with, if you're a little off on one side or the other, it'll even out a little better than if you just have a tiny bit of epoxy. Okay, so now we're going to mix this. Basically, I've just got essentially a little popsicle stick that I cut in half because you only need about half of it to do one of these. And you're just going to basically work it together until you have one consistent color. Sometimes the epoxies will be, one part will be clear and the other part will be black. Sometimes one will be more white and one will be more yellow. You just want to keep working them until they are a consistent color, basically about 30 seconds. The real key to making epoxy work correctly is to mix it thoroughly and make sure that you're putting it onto surfaces that have been properly prepped, that being sanded to get either the chrome or the paint, if we're talking about graphite, off. Okay, so we've probably been mixing this for about, I don't know, this is about 50 seconds. We'll do just a couple more seconds. Again, you might want to do this in a pretty well ventilated area. The epoxies, especially the 5-minute epoxies, have a pretty unique smell, we'll say. Okay, so we now have our epoxy. All right, here we go. First off, we're going to take a little bit of epoxy on the end of our stick, and we're going to coat as far down inside the shaft as the extension is going to go. You don't need to use that much. You just want to use enough to basically coat all the surfaces. You don't want big glops of it wedged in there, just enough to coat all the surfaces. Okay, next, we're going to take the extension. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to take a little bit of epoxy, and we're basically just going to smear it over here, just trying to cover the surfaces. Again, do not glop it on. It doesn't need a lot. It's a pretty tight little space that this epoxy is going into, so if there's extra, it's either going to come squeezing out of the end or it's going to go up inside the shaft, neither of which is the ideal situation. So you just want to use enough just to coat it. Okay, so now we've got epoxy on the shaft and on the extension. I'm going to do this so you can watch it. In general, I would do this in an up and down fashion, but I'm going to do it like this for the camera. You want to take the extension, slide it into the shaft, and as you're putting it in, you want to rotate it. You want to keep turning it all the way. Once it's all the way in and seated as far as it'll go, give it another, say, half turn to full turn, just to make sure all that epoxy is evenly distributed. Now I'll hold the shaft like this upright. Now we've got a little bit of epoxy, basically, that's oozed out between the extension and the shaft. You've got a couple options for that. In general, the simplest way to do it is just get yourself a paper towel. You can get a little bit of grip solvent and put that on the paper towel, just a tiny bit, and that'll help clean it up and get all the epoxy off. So I just basically wipe that off. So now the shaft and the extension are both in here. We're going to let this dry. We're going to turn it upside down, supporting the extension, remember. And I'm just going to bring it over here to set and dry. Okay, so that's basically it. We're going to let that extension sit in there for about 10 to 15 minutes, let it really dry, and then we can basically just go and re-grip it like we would grip any other golf club. One other tip, whenever you're doing anything with epoxy, I like to save whatever I mix the epoxy with, in this case this little piece of cardboard, and put it over next to the job that I just did with it. I need a way to figure out, is this ready? Can I pick this up? Can I start messing around with it, or does it need to sit? There's no way to do that with the actual club unless you pick it up and try and twist the shaft, in which case you've now lost any sort of good bond you had with that epoxy. This way, you can feel the epoxy on the piece of cardboard or in the mixing cup, and you'll be able to tell, is it hard? Can I go and cut the shaft if I need to, put the grip on, whatever I need to do. So save whatever you mix the epoxy with, put it right next to whatever club you did or sets of clubs you did, and keep it there until it's hard and you're ready to go on to the next step. That way you know. So that's how it's done. And guess what? We've now gone through all the basic steps that you're going to need to assemble an entire golf club. And that's going to be what we discuss in episode 4. But until then, I want to thank you for watching. Again, if you enjoyed this video and you found it helpful, please like it, share it, or subscribe. And until next time, keep it in the short grass. Thanks.